This presentation today is a call to action to invite all of us to go beyond the quiet politics and invite the diversity of voices of all people around the table in this new eco-social world. Understanding quiet politics and its nature and through its practice, quiet politics are actually embedded in the elite theories, which explains how privileged leaders are not only offered spaces to create legislative and regulatory environments that largely serve their interest, they are also comfortable without any stigmas at using an arsenal of influential and effective tools to reach the legislative and regulatory outcomes they prefer. Quiet politics, although being understood as one of the key characteristics of a democratic world, can also exacerbate political exclusion within any given society. Particularly because those successful systems where quiet politics often strive are not necessarily open to people with non-elite backgrounds, which is actually an example of exclusionary practices. It is clear that political exclusion is an obstacle to one's participation and engagement in the political arena, and it has been rendering communities voiceless for centuries. So this particular reality of political exclusion can become even more complex and actually disheartening when considering some of the predictors of political exclusion, such as money, historically grounded inequalities, racial inequalities, class-based inequalities, incarceration, imprisonment, and even stigmatization. All of those variables can create a climate for people to be excluded in political activities in any given society. Therefore, in this new eco-social world, building the efforts to frame and define a new eco-social contract, we must be involved, we must understand, and we must embrace and respect the voices of the people, which is a way to go beyond this aspect, the aspect of quiet politics. By understanding, embracing, and respecting the voices of the people, that automatically will lead us to the crux of social advocacy, which is in essence the foundations of this presentation. And right here we can see that social advocacy can be understood as an active promotion of social change, an active promotion of equality, an active promotion of justices, whether it's racial, social, economic, or environmental. Participating in this sort of active promotion of justices while inviting governments, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, corporations, or other large institutions to correct some unfair and harmful situations they may have caused. Of course, with the hope of developing better conditions and situations. Therefore, embracing the diversity of voices is actually one way to go beyond the quiet politics and allow communities, translocal communities, glocal communities, immediate communities, to create empowering spaces so they can be involved in the realm of political decision-making processes and also exert their political influence. That means they must create those spaces that are empowering to develop political discourses, reinforce political ideologies, access policymakers, and why not even force politicians to change their traditional systems of interaction with their constituents. The voices of the people are needed around the table. We must offer those spaces, and those spaces must be empowering. So that being said, this presentation on embracing voices in the new eco-social world is actually a call to action. This presentation is placing advocacy, its values, implications, importance, and requirements at the forefront of the conversation regarding the new eco-social world. This presentation is also encouraging scholars, educators, practitioners, community members, legislators to comfortably embrace the various forms of advocacy, whether it's social advocacy, community advocacy, justice advocacy, legislative advocacy, political advocacy, that will support the ideals of a more inclusive and equitable eco-social world. To continue with the main idea of and principles and values regarding embracing the diversity of voices, as I mentioned earlier, translocal community and glocal community, it is important for me to define a few of those concepts before I underline the main principles and values regarding embracing voices. The very first concept I want to highlight and define is translocality. This particular concept provides us with a different understanding of place, space, locality, people, and their interactions. Translocality captures the interconnectedness and processes that actually happen in and between different localities through a variety of transactions among people. Translocality is actually presenting to us the main idea of what happened when the local, its realities, its issues, its conditions, when the local stretches beyond its border. Translocality emphasizes on the interaction, the transaction, the exchanges between actors from a specific locality and actors from other localities to interact at a particular space. All those actors can be from different places, and they can meet, they can cooperate with global or local context. And that often happens within networked environments. And those environments can be digital, they can be virtual, and they can also be physical. And other authors who actually researched translocality from a variety of perspectives, they argued that those networked environments that translocality is through which translocality is being developed, those environments are actually non-linear. They are open and they are constantly questions and reworked, and they are constantly being changed, and they are constantly being modified and remodified. With this idea of changes within specific environments, bring us to the next concept that we need to define alongside translocality. Glocality and glocalization is also important. If in translocality we are focusing on different local actors from different spaces and they meet in a particular networked environment considered local or translocal, where they share translocal spaces, they participate in translocal dialogues or conversations. Glocalization or glocality is actually goes a little bit beyond translocality, because glocalization embraces not just the local aspect, also the global aspect of people's interactions. Glocalization is the actual merger, is the actual connection between the global and local perspectives, between the local and global issues, local and global realities. global and local living conditions of people, whether they are socioeconomic, economic, political, cultural, that have some sort of impact on their lives. At that point of connection, that point of interaction, that intersection between the global and the local, that actually what creates this concept of glocality or glocalization. One important characteristics of glocalization is that while there is this merger, there is this connection, there is this intersection between the global and the local aspect, or the global and the local communities, all communities in that merger maintain their contribution to that particular interaction. They do not lose their identity. They bring their cultural elements, they bring their ethnic elements to the global realities, they bring their cultural element to the global conditions, to the global conversations, and global activities. In other words, at that point of intersection, the global does not render the local invisible. The globality, the global aspect does not render the local aspect invisible. The local aspects maintain its significant contributions, and the global aspect of globalization also maintain its significant contributions. Which is quite different than globalization. Glocalization or glocality actually rejects this idea of ethnocentrism. Of course, ethnocentrism establishes specific worldviews that consist of, judging, defining, evaluating other cultural communities through some sort of biased or tinted lenses of their own cultural standpoint. In fact, glocalization and glocality empowers and encourages all stakeholders to work together in harmony toward a better life or toward a sustainable future. Again, if in the perspective of ever-changing environment that I mentioned earlier when I presented on translocality, it is also important to understand the concept of liquid modernity. The modern world, how it is being seen as more liquid than it is static or rigid. Liquid modernity is understood as this condition of constant mobility and changes in relationships, identities, global economics within contemporary society. This idea of constant change, this idea of constant movement is at the forefront of the concept of liquid modernity. So alongside with liquid modernity comes the identities that are associated with this type of development that is occurring. So, of course, if we understand that liquid modernity in terms of conditions that favors constant change, constant mobility, whether they are marginal or they are privileged mobilities, but they are occurring in our society. So therefore, liquid identity is associated with this type of modernity that we are currently experiencing. And in our world, and even more likely in this new eco-social world that we are framing and developing. So liquid identity is seen as flexible, adjustable, because of course we understand people are being exposed to changing environments, change cultures, and values and norms. Therefore, it is also believed that their identities become liquid in the sense that they can constantly be adjusted to new cultural norms, new environments, and those adjustments are being developed through the way they interact with one another, the way they interact with the digital component of our world, the way they interact with the Internet of Things, and so on and so forth. And of course, this concept of liquid identity focuses a lot on the constant changes that is happening, the constant changes that are happening in this ever-changing world. And therefore, as humans, we have to adapt, we have to adjust to those new norms and new environments, new activities, and even new relationships. So again, going beyond quiet politics to embrace voices of various communities, both translocal and glocal communities, while keeping in mind how adjustable our identities are, there are some important principles that we must keep in mind if we are aiming at embracing voices of people. Doesn't matter if their identities are different than ours, based on age, class, ethnicity, race, and so on and so forth. They must be offered, or they must take their place around the table. So that means some of the important values that this presentation will invite all of you to consider is that communities must be able to create spaces to advocate and position themselves to benefit from the new eco-social contract. Their demands must be respected, heard, and treated with dignity in this new eco-social world. Their traditions and activism must be seen as empowering and strategic, which should be comparable to how the political world dignifies the lobbying and financing capacities of the elite actors. It should be comparable to that. Traditions of minorities, their skills, their qualities to advocate and to be active in political affairs, depending on the tools they use, should not be demonized, should not be stigmatized either. It should be comparable to the lobbying, the financing capacities of the elite actors, both institutional elites and corporate elites. Of course, I just mentioned should not be stigmatized, and they should not be demonized. So that means we must understand, we must respect the mechanisms and significance of voices, the advocacy tools that communities use, because that can help nurture relationships of equality. It can help relocate power, and it can help us share resources more equitably, and definitely help us achieve collective goals for the betterment of our communities. And in addition, in the face of persistent social, economic, racial, and environmental injustice, communities, they have the right to express their demands using the appropriate voices in order to be heard. They have the right, the freedom of expression. They must do that using the appropriate voices, the appropriate tools, so they can be heard. Because when the damages, when the decapitalization, when the injustices, when the oppressive structures are being designed, are being decided upon, are being developed, are being maintained through quiet politics, affected communities have the choice. They have the choice to either play the quiet political game. They can choose to do that and lose every single time, or they can develop more vocalized political strategies. They can either play the quiet political games, of course they will lose every single time, or they can choose different tools. As communities, Black and Indigenous, people of color, or minoritized communities, our voices should matter, and it must be viewed as intersectional, considering class, gender, nationality, religion, sexual orientation, age, and race. And last key elements in terms of principles and values that we must take into account is that support, sponsor, and encourage minoritized communities all around the world to develop or reinforce translocal empowering spaces that can help nurture collaboration, growth, and collective efficacy to fight for and benefit from an inclusive and equitable eco-social world. So in the end, the foundational framework, in order to remember everything that I just discussed, is to take a look at that framework, to embrace voices in this new eco-social world. We must not demonize advocacy. We must understand that advocacy can happen through and with various communities, translocal, global, immediate, corporate, and governmental. And their efforts to advocate aim at creating spaces, politically position themselves, and advocate for the betterment of their communities, to combat racial, economic, and environmental injustices. And we must respect, we must be inclusive, we must guarantee equity, and we must fight for justice. And in terms of approaches, translocal or global communities, minoritized communities, in other words, BIPOC communities, their efforts should be seen as empowering and strategic. As I said earlier, comparable to how we dignify, how the political world dignifies and veneers quiet politics. And lastly, our voices should be seen as intersectional, because as liquid as our identities are, as liquid as our identities can be, we must take into consideration all categories of our identities. Because this new eco-social world must benefit and must be inclusive to all. Thank you.